So it's funny, Matt, you mentioned we didn't start the fire. You want to hear a real Long Island Hours story?
Oh, hell yes. Give it to me.
My grandfather lived out in Suffolk County, not far from where Billy had one of his homes. And one of my grandfather's friends was like a maintenance guy, right? So he worked for Billy Joel. Back in the, I'd say like mid 80s, late 80s, this maintenance guy goes over to Billy Joel's house, and Billy Joel's sitting in his office, and he's like, I need this done and that done, whatever. So the guy looks around Billy Joel's place, and there are just tons and tons and tons of like Time and Newsweek magazines going all the way back, it's like the 40s and 50s. And the guy's like, what? He's just really, really obsessed with like Henry Louis or something like that. And then, he didn't understand it until a year later. The fucking song came out. It was Billy Joel getting into the fucking archives.
That was his process. Motherfucker researched a fucking pop song. That is dedication.
That is real dedication.
I gotta say, I gotta give him more credit after hearing that. He didn't just take a bunch of lewds and start listing things that he remembered from his childhood.
He may have been on lewds also.
Well, probably, but at least he kind of engaged with the time period and its popular culture, the media.
And if you think about all these kind of touchstone cultural moments that he lived through, what better way to get to them than to simply take all of these like popular magazines and just look at the fucking front cover, right?
And just list things that happen.
Yes.
Without regard for coherence, thematics, vague rhyme, the only thing you care about. Yeah. That's the kind of slipshod, impressionistic, totally systemenless approach to thinking about history that leads you to, at the end of your song, to announce, after all that stuff that you've talked about, from thalidomide babies to the JFK assassination, the thing that will no longer allow you to take it, the thing after which you can't take it anymore.
I forgot. What was it?
Cola Wars.
Cola Wars. That's right.
That's it.
We can't take it anymore.
Rock and rolla Cola Wars. It's like, whatever, Vietnam War, nuking Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
British
part of the
minister sex and all that.
Part of the rich historical pageant. But two soda companies,
Pepsi and
Coke, having a high cost public relations warfare.
That's the end of history, my friend.
It kind of is. Maybe that's what he meant. Maybe he wasn't making a moral judgment.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Maybe he was anticipating Fukuyama.
That's possible.
Like he's talking about this historical process.
It was the right time.
Found its apotheosis, its synthesis in the consumer world where warfare, real conflict, like Dien Bien Phu and all the things he talked about, Korea, Incheon, has been replaced by Cola War.
It's like, all right, how about this? It's like commodity fetishism, but we have social relations. We see like things having social relations with each other, right? Yeah. And we don't understand ourselves in that process. And it's the same in this instance with like violence.
Yes.
So it's almost like a fetishized violent form or something.
And turned
like
it into a synthesized violence, but one that has transcended the conflict, the physical reality.
It's merely the conflict between commodities.
It is, exactly. I knew that Billy Joel was a history teacher. I think he was a high school history teacher.
Was he really?
Yes, as a young man.
Oh, cool.
But I did not know that he was a Hegelian.
I had no idea.
He is clearly a Hegelian, and I apologize for ever saying that he was a corny.
He is corny, but I have to say we should have known when, that one famous single from his first record, The Owl of Minerva Flies at Dusk. Remember that one? Yeah, we should have known he was really a Hegelian the entire time.
He's into it. Wow.
He's definitely down.
I need to start looking at some of these other songs that I have thought were trifles. Like, wait a minute, it's still rock and roll to him? What does that mean? Is he talking about sort of the way that that the material relationship and size of the baby boom generation would make them dominate popular culture for a supernaturally long time and distort all other cultural trends because of their dominance, because of their place sort of at the golden peak of Western capitalism?
Is it an epistemological or ontological question?
Yes.
Really, right? Is it about being or is it about understanding?
Yeah.
I think that could be an episode in and of itself.
Absolutely.
We'll have to go and celebrate his entire oeuvre. Have a
clearly
nice listening
he was a heavy
party.
hitter. Eat your heart out, Zizich. Listen to some Billy Joel songs and you'll get way more.
Oh, I love it that he's a fucking total drunk, been out of rehab like 6 or 7 times. But, I always say this because you've been spending some time on Long Island. I don't know why the fuck.
Yes, I have. Suffolk County, baby. What's up?
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's my Heimat.
Yeah,
but,
no, it's a bummer for sure.
Yeah, I always kind of hated it because if you're like a suburban kid in the metropolitan area, if you're from Long Island, you have Billy Joel.
Yeah.
But if you're from New Jersey, who do you got?
Got the boss.
Got the fucking boss, man.
Jeez, that's just
brutal.
That is some Goofus and Gallant right there.
Brutal shit.
Damn,
but you know what?
That is Jose and Ozzy Canseco. Fuck.
Communist greetings, friends, fiends, and everybody in between. This is Sean KB from the Antifada with another episode of History is a Weapon. Some apologies to you folks out there. It has been 6 months since I announced this ongoing series and put out that first episode on historical materialism. Part of becoming an adult, part of knowing yourself as a human being, is about understanding what you're good at and recognizing the things that you suck at. And I will admit to you all now that I have really sucked at the diligence it takes to essentially write a 12-page paper on history, take about 7 revisions and about 10 takes to make it absolutely fucking perfect. The History as a Weapon as a monologue has been a very, very difficult task for me. So, recognizing that my brain is broken, I thought that instead of a monologue, that perhaps we should have a dialogue. So for that very reason, I am proud to introduce to you our guest today. He doesn't really need an introduction. He is Matt Christman from Trap House. What's up, Matt?
How you doing, buddy? Let's get our Bakhtin on.
Hell yeah.
Let's do some fucking dialogue.
Dead ass. We are going to be talking about, I think, a subject that's very topical at this point in time, and maybe a question that a lot of people have out there, which is, why hasn't there been socialism, a socialist party, a labor party in the United States? The rest of the advanced capitalist world seems to have got on this train. What's going on here?
It is a mystery. It was first posed in 1906 by Werner Sombart. He looked around Europe and he saw that in countries, many of which had only had universal manhood suffrage for maybe 20 years at that point, every one of them had a robust socialist party with deep ties to labor unions to the point where they were essentially organs of labor.
Right.
In all the bigger countries, including former reactionary bastions like Wilhelmine Germany.
Sure.
And yet the United States, which had had universal manhood suffrage in at least parts of the country since its inception, and throughout the whole country since the 1820s, just Jacksonian populist tradition, why the hell does it have a Democratic Party and a Republican Party that both try to appeal to maybe labor as a voting segment, but are these cross-class coalition parties?
Exactly.
What is going on?
What is going on with that?
And we are living with the legacy of it, of course, to this day.
The very unfortunate legacy. And just to add a finer point onto that, he's looking around the world and saying, why isn't this expressing itself in political form? While at the same time, the United States, of course, is going through this incredibly violent process of class struggle.
Absolutely.
Workers and
incredibly violent.
Yeah.
Way more violence. And you could look at the correlation there because they were denied a meaningful representation in government. They were forced to use violence more frequently. And then the state was much more willing to deal it out. And we'll talk about why that is.
We're going to talk a lot about that very, very violent history of the United States labor question, as they called it back in the day. But before we jump into the meat of things, I want to get a little personal here. Not too personal, Matt, don't worry. We're about 5 feet away from each other. You don't have to worry about any stray hands or anything like that. But I don't know. We've hung out, a fair amount of times. Yeah. And I think every time, no matter how drunk we've been, no matter what the occasion was, no matter who was around us, we got into some very, very involved and ranty and deep, nerdy conversation about some historical question or episode. It just kind of spontaneously came out of us.
It's true, yeah. If we're talking, it's not going to take more than it's like 6 degrees of some deep, thorny historical issue.
When we met that first time, I think it was the Lordstown strikes, right? Like we're at
the 1970s, which we then turned into an episode.
We sure as fuck did, and we also talked about Big Rock Candy Mountain as like
this
lumpen proletarian sort of conception of a post-capitalist abundance.
Yeah, where they have the thing, but they don't have any consciousness of how to get to it.
Yeah, almost like the peasants, are unable to be a revolutionary class, which, again, will be very, very topical, I think, for this conversation. So, in light of that, I think it's interesting to ask ourselves, and I ask myself this a lot, but, like, why has your brain been broken by history? I have a sense of why my brain has been broken by history and why I'm so fucking obsessed. I'd go so far as to say I am tyrannized by history. It weighs on me like a nightmare. What is it? What is it that drew you to this particular discipline? What does it do for you?
Ooh, yes, history indeed, weighing like a nightmare on the brains of the living. For me, I think back on it, and it's funny. I was on a different podcast, very different podcast, a while ago, a Dragon Ball Z podcast.
Wow.
They made me watch an anime, which I'd never done before.
I actually, parenthetically, I have to do that too for Alex Patax. He's going to make me watch anime for the first time.
Oh boy! Well, good luck, buddy.
Horrific.
It's not for me. I'll just say that. And they and one of the traditions on their show is that they would ask somebody, whoever they were talking to, what's their history with the show? When did they learn they loved it? How long have they been watching it? And they asked me, and of course I didn't have that because the whole gimmick of my coming on was I'd never watched anime before, so I have no history with it.
It's like a foreshadow of my future on Alex's show, but yeah.
So then they asked me instead, well, what did you have? What did you have instead? And for some reason, the way they asked it in the context of being on the show, I could only think in terms of what was your pop culture thing.
Right.
What was the show you watched? What was the game you played? What was the pop culture thing that you obsessed about?
Sure. The media expression.
Yeah,
like
the media
anime
expression that is also, of course, also consumer expression because
right.
Pokemon cards or Pogs or something like that.
It becomes an identity as well.
Exactly. Or video games,
right.
Comic books, baseball cards even.
Yeah.
And I thought about it, and I had a little mini breakdown on the show because I felt like, oh my God, I've never liked anything.
Isn't it bad having an existential breakdown in the middle
it's
of the podcast?
It's not great. I mean, I guess some people enjoy listening to it, but it's not fun to have.
Those fucking sadists.
Yeah, exactly. But I was just sort of struck by the fact that I've never really had a thing. I've always very lightly held my cultural preferences. I've never really been fixated on any of them. And then I realized weeks later that I had not thought of the question the right way. They weren't really just asking me that. They were asking what was the thing you were focused on, not necessarily pop culture. And I realized, the reason I wasn't any of those things, the reason I held all my cultural shit very, very loosely is because I was a Civil War nerd.
The Civil War got you.
I was, by the time I was in 6th grade, fucking obsessed with the Civil War. My mom got me all these books. I had a whole Time Life series on them. My mom got me McClellan's biography. There's these cards. Kids had fucking Pokemon cards. There's cards you could order. They had a whole bunch of them for different subjects, but one of the lines was Civil War. They came in a recipe box, and they were big cards, big about the size of a postcard, that had a picture on the front and then a historical fact on the back about battle of the Civil War, character from the Civil War, history, historical event, and they'd send you every month. They'd send you a different pack, and you'd fill these boxes with them. I had little pewter figurines. I had a model of like the Battle of Gettysburg with little dudes, and plastic terrain that you had to paint to look like grass and shit.
I remember that. Yeah.
I had all that. I drew Civil War pictures. I had a whole sketchbook full of Civil War battle scenes. There was one I did. I took 4 fucking full sketch pages. I taped them together. It was I think Little Round, or no, it was Little Round Top. Like I was totally obsessed with it. And I remember I took in junior high, I was in a history class. It was U.S. history. I was a awful little brown noser. And one semester we were doing the Civil War, and I was so confident about it. I was so cocky. I was like, oh, Civil War? Oh, you fools. Don't you realize I've been studying for this for years?
You're ready to name the battle.
Yeah, I'll destroy anyone on this subject.
All the generals.
This A is already mine.
Right.
So I was so smug about this fact I was going to get an A, and I was going to just own it. It's like a fluent native Spanish speaker going to an American school and going into ESL.
Yeah.
And it's just crushing.
Yeah, ready to own.
But then in that class, there was a requirement that once you got assigned a day, and you had to come that day having prepared a rundown of the news. We're supposed to just encourage you to pay attention to the news. All I gotta say is 3 headlines that you've looked watching the news or reading a newspaper. And they told you the date in advance, but I forgot it when the day came. And the thing was, you had to get it to get an A. And so that meant I couldn't get an A in the class.
Ooh.
And this caused me deep, deep, deep trauma. So what I did, I spent an entire weekend with a Time Life book on Gettysburg, and on a manual typewriter, I typed out a 12-page, single-spaced history of the Battle of Gettysburg, not quite plagiarized from the book, but I would read it and reword it.
Yeah.
And I drew a little picture on the cover, and I handed it to him as an extra credit assignment that would get me an A.
Did it get you the A?
Well, the guy was kind of a smart ass,
Yeah.
and what he did was he took it and just immediately, without looking at it, dropped it in the garbage can.
Sick burn. For
Hugely sick
kid.
burn.
Ouch.
Just massively sick burn.
Oof.
But if I do remember correctly, so he never told me it was going to work. But if I do remember correctly, I got an A-.
Not bad. Not bad.
So to long-windedly answer your question, I was, for some reason that I still don't understand, fixated by the Civil War.
See, it's interesting the Civil War, because I feel like that's one of the elements of popular history that is a gateway for a lot of people to get into you know, the whole genre.
The one thing I wasn't was a reenactor, and my friend in college was. My friend in college was a reenactor.
That is a weird perversion, if you ask
me. Oh yeah,
no,
totally.
But I think the obsession of it, and I guess in my mind I would surmise that the reason why Americans are so obsessed. It was, of course, a very important event. Is that maybe the pathos of like brother against brother, like this sense of disunity and all the violence, and also what was part of it was this heroic struggle to like actually complete the bourgeois revolution, right? To get rid of slavery. But I think that you were fortunate, for whatever reasons, I don't know what they are, that you didn't get stuck into that rut, because I feel like a lot of people get into the Civil War and
they never leave.
They never leave it, and then maybe they'll get into like World War I battles and World War II. And I'm sorry, but like the history I'm least interested in is like military history. Yeah. I mean, the history of wars is interesting in and of itself, but like clearly you got yourself out of this sort of list of dates and generals.
Oh yeah, no, totally.
Yourself forward.
It was actually, thinking back on it, the trajectory is both in terms of my approach to history and also my approach to politics was shaped by my relationship, or reflected by my relationship with the Civil War. Because I started off just caring about the battles, cool battles, drawing pictures of guys getting shot, reading about guys, enfilade fire, saber charge, all that shit, and thinking also politically in terms of this was a tragic battle of brother against brother. No real bad guys, really.
Right. Yeah.
Robert E. Lee was an honorable man. He didn't even like slavery.
Yeah.
I believed all that shit.
Yeah.
And then over time, the political dimension of the Civil War comes into focus, and you're like, wow, this was a radical fucking. This is the most important like liberatory army to walk the earth since the fucking Spartacus rebellion.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, this is amazing. There's an army of liberation, like the revolutionary potential of it, and then how it was redirected and then destroyed. Is like that's the real tragedy. It's not the fucking Clem and Bob facing each other across the field with raised pistols.
If the original sin of the United States was the obliteration of the Native American people, then our Cain-slaying Abel moment was certainly the failure to follow through with Reconstruction after this revolutionary moment.
So that it's those two things flowered in peace. As I'm understanding the political of it, then the non-military aspects of it became more interesting, and then the tendrils go out, and you see how they connect to other things, and all of a sudden that fascination you had as a kid with the Battle of Shiloh or whatever, Hornet's Nest, all of a sudden you can see that in everything, in everything from the life of a fucking peasant in the 13th century Italy or something, or the suffragette battle, anything, a presidential history, any strata you cut it, there's something fascinating that reveals something else interesting, all of which reflect on the politics.
It's interesting because it just reminded me that one of the ways that people characterize Marxism, which I think both you and I are very much influenced by, is that it's a conflict theory.
Yes.
And so you begin with the Civil War, which is obviously a violent conflict, right? But then I suppose you continue within that strain, but understand that the conflict is not merely men at arms, North versus South, Union and Confederacy, or even good versus bad, but ultimately this sort of conflict, is throughout society and happening even when there is not a civil war.
Yes.
At that time.
Yeah.
All right, so we just basically just had a historical therapy session.
Yeah, but that's also where my politics were sharpened, because as I thought about the war more, I focused less on the nobleness of like this Confederacy or whatever, to realize, they were fighting to keep slavery. That's pretty fucked up. And then I looked at how that history is remembered and who now likes to defend the Confederacy. And to me, it's like, well, if you like the Confederacy, then you are pretty fucked up. Mm-hmm. You got some bad ideas, because that was a bad place. It's one of the worst things anybody's ever made, is the Confederacy.
Yeah.
And liking it now, that's a red flag. And so that really shaped my politics. It's like, so everything kind of flows from that. It's like, well, what were the values of the people who ended that war? The best of them, the most far-seeing of them. What are the values of the people who wanted to fight on to like either stop it from happening or do a counter-revolution afterwards? And that really shaped. It was the guiding light of figuring out the larger question.
It's a great historical question, right? Because history is about remembrance, right? It's about how a society, how a people's write down things that actually happened, and then how they interpret them,
right?
And then what that subsequently means. So like the most interesting question is like not why reactionaries today would uphold the Confederacy as a good thing when it was a horrific thing. But the question is like, why did the majority of the white non-slave owners in the South, which were the people that actually fought that war, why did they line up with the aristocracy, with the slave power, in order to fight this brutal war where many of them got killed? And that's where I think that's the more interesting question, is when you situate in time, what was it like to be this person in the Confederacy who didn't have that large of a material stake, but maybe a psychological stake or some larger structural stake in it? That's where I think history gets really, really interesting. And I can tell you my little shorthand. I was gifted as a kid, not mentally. I've always been a complete fucking idiot, but I was gifted with having a great grandfather who was born in Brooklyn. He was born in the year 1897. Wow. When I was a kid, he was just great grandpa, pop-up, and he did everything wrong in life that you're supposed to do. Or not supposed to do, I should say. He worked in a factory. He was a union factory worker, so he was around fumes and dust all day with no mask or whatever, being a mechanic. He smoked 2-3 packs a day till he was in his late 80s. He would tell us as kids when we were younger, he'd be like, the trick to winning at the pool is never have more than 5 whiskeys. I only have 5 whiskeys a night. Long story short is he lived to be 103.
Of course.
He did. That's like good German stock, right? He did great work. But it really fascinated me as a kid to hear these stories that, by God, I wish I'd fucking recorded them. Imagine somebody living like this, these sort of connections that the past that we have. I'm listening to this guy who was in my family tell me about the first time he saw an automobile.
Oh shit!
Telling me about the first time he saw an airplane, about Babe Ruth's first appearance as a New York Yankee.
Wow.
Being mustard gassed in World War I.
Jesus.
There was a real sense for me, and I was pretty close with him, that like the past is not past.
Right.
And that was a very unique experience for me. And then again, like you, I was just very, very obsessed with this story too. My uncle, he gave me a present. My uncle was always giving me like books, like sci-fi and fantasy books, but he gave me this incredible thing. I wish I could find it again, but it was like a kid's history book. But within it, there was it's like a flow chart that you could rip out of the book, and it was about 20 feet long. And I hung it up on the wall of my room, and it showed you like the civilizations and the powers throughout history as like lines.
Oh,
running
I
through.
remember that.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, I remember
and
that.
They connect together and they break
apart.
apart.
That
Sumerians
thing ruled.
And Hittites.
Yeah, there's like a little Anubis in the corner.
Yeah, and then it starts with Adam and Eve, which is fucking ridiculous, and it ends with the Soviet Union because this was still the 80s. But I remember just for like hours at night, I would just sit there and I would look at the little lines of like, when Luxembourg came around, and then I would go to the Encyclopedia Britannica and be like, why is this little fucking Luxembourg, nation around? It's this tiny little.
Yeah.
There was something very, very I don't know, very fascinating about this sort of connection between today and the past. And I think that ultimately, as time went on, I think the explanatory powers of history are such that it went from just being a pastime or a hobby or just like that discipline that I chose when I ended up going to college and then subsequently dropping out of grad school, which I think you did too.
Oh yeah,
but, it became something that actually I do believe when I say history is a weapon, as Howard Zinn said, that it is a very potent tool that we have as socialists, communists, anarchists, whatever we are, because the past is not past, and we certainly can't go back and LARP and reenact the things that our forebears did before us, but we can certainly learn A, what not to do, and B, how we got in this fucking situation that we are in today.
Absolutely.
So jumping into the big question, why no socialism in the United States? Why, unlike Britain, Germany, Australia even, we'll talk a little bit about Australia, many other advanced capitalist countries, why not a Labor Party? Why not a socialist movement? And I think the explanations that we often get can be, I guess, easiest described with the word exceptionalism, right? There's something about the United States.
America's just, it's its own thing.
It's
that term that Stalin famously coined, American exceptionalism.
It's cultural Marxism.
Yeah.
There's this sense, I think, that people get, and I think that you're taught that liberty, our Constitution, our founding fathers,
we love liberty too much for socialism to take root in the stony American soil of self-reliance.
Individualist. We cannot, bow down before.
That's the Jonah Goldberg thesis. He's talked about how we could never bow down to a king, so we could never bow down to some socialist medical facility or something like that.
Or because Eugene Debs, which was very monarchical.
Because we said nuts to you, King George. So our liberty hearts are too fired.
Isn't that? That argument is used. There's a lot of arguments that the right wing uses today against even like the most tepid forms of socialism, like AOC or Bernie Sanders type socialism. But there is still used as a weapon this sense that socialism is un-American, that indeed the conception that there is a struggle between classes, whether that's just like a strike or whether that is, perhaps even a revolution, is fundamentally un-American in this particularly exceptional country. Is it fair to say that there might be some better explanations for perhaps why the U.S. never developed this?
Yeah, there's a whole range of plausible things, some of them having to do with the structure of American governance and politics because of that, some of it having to do with the material conditions. And I think, as in most things, it's a mixture of all of those. You have things from the sort of structural idea that says that because America got the Democratic Party so early as sort of a cross-class populist party, well, before the labor movement really existed, before there was really such a thing as a working class,
one of the oldest parties in the world.
Yeah, at a time when artisans dominated and workers were relatively scarce. The other party systems in Europe came into being at the exact same time that mass working classes came into being. Yes. Those were inextricably linked. So when they were like, okay, we're going to create some parties now, the idea of the workers creating one it made sense. It was obviously they are, because what else are they going to do?
Right.
They're here now.
We're starting parties now.
We're starting parties now. We're a party,
right.
Or we're a class of itself with interests. But there was no working class of itself in America when the class system or when the party system was formed,
right.
Which means that when they finally show up, these are pre-existing structures that they have to accommodate, and so they do things like try to create third parties or the populist party, whatever, and inevitably have their energy absorbed by the class Democratic Party that uses them as one part of a subsidiary of interest groups that make up its base.
And this is actually, again, something that more intelligent people will argue, right, is the way that the American political structure is set up, with a first past the post and its particular, the three branches of government, that instead of a parliamentary system where you could have a small, influential socialist or communist party that could go in coalition with other groups, you had to create coalitions within the parties themselves.
Yes.
Cross-class, but also cross, interests.
Because all votes sort towards only meaningfully impacting one or the other parties, positively or negatively, whereas the sorting of votes in a parliamentary system allows for power to be non-binary, some measure of power existing to a third or fourth grouping. American power is distributed binarily because all of your protest votes. It's just a fact. Like, they love to talk about, the libs love talking about it.
Jill
but
Stein and her
the
crystals,
thing is,
or jade vagina eggs.
They are smug, and they are often totally delusional and wrong. But their banal point that voting for a third party, if you don't want the worst capitalist party to win, is a vote. It's a vote. It is taking a vote away from what you would prefer to the worst case.
Yeah, legitimately, right.
That's a fact.
Yeah.
And that is only a thing that exists really in the American, as built into it and as unchangeable. Like a lot of parliamentary systems end up going to a homeostasis of two parties, like Labor Party and like the Labor and Tories. Yeah. But remember, before it was the Labor,
and the SVD,
before it was Labor Party and the Tories in the UK, it was the Liberal Party and the Tories until Labour came into being and eventually just supplanted them.
Right.
That could only have happened in a parliamentary system.
And again, going back to what you were saying, with like a class-based party, right, which the United States doesn't have, the Tories and the Liberals, when those were the two major parties in Britain, right, the Tories were representing literally the aristocratic landed elite, whereas the Liberals were the more forward-thinking bourgeoisie, essentially, right, who were arising in society at that time and had a party already to represent their class interests for free trade and for property rights and all this sort of thing.
And the fucking Corn Law.
And the motherfucking Corn Law. Go back to your Polanyi, folks, and read about that embeddedness and the Corn Laws and all that. But I think that, like, so we've now gone from the exceptionalism argument, right, which we've kind of dismissed as being just bizarrely idealist and explaining absolutely nothing. Then we've gone down a deeper level, which is, I think everything that we said about that is true. But then, this is the real trick. This is where history gets interesting, is we're going to get down to the actual structural, political, economic, and geographic aspects of this. And what actually separates the United States as an entity geographically and in its formation from, say, old Europe, or even from a place like China, or as I think you're going to argue with the Parsons, it's a book, the Parsons book, Australia, which has a very similar history of settler colonialism.
Yes.
So I think it's important for folks to note, of course, that there were millions of people living on what is now the United States before 1492. Those people had lived here for many, many thousands of years.
Indeed. Bering Land Bridge, what's up?
Yeah, what up? I think there's not too many left, like a few 100,000. And that, again, as I said, was really the original sin of this country. I think, like, the first thing is to confront this conception of settler colonialism, not just because of the genocidal aspects of it, which are obviously absolutely fucking horrific, but also because of the political economic effects that has of having a frontier, moving forward through the American Revolutionary period and up until, say, the end of the 19th century.
Yes.
So let's talk a bit about that. I think, just so folks out there know, like, Matt and I just spitballed like all this shit that we're about to say at a bar, like totally drunk in like 10 minutes. This is kind of like in our wheelhouse. We're kind of flying by wire now, but we're just going to go ahead and make this happen.
Yeah. Let's light this candle.
We were talking about what, like the United States had it had a political revolution, but it never had a social revolution.
Right, and that was by design.
Right.
The makers of the founding fathers, the reason they're worshipped as gods by the right wing is because they were far-seeing, brilliant reactionaries who understood that in their quest basically to create a better economic arrangement with their mother country, sort of a separatist movement of landowners and a rising merchant class. They didn't want to do what often happens when an elite attempts to agitate, which is stir up too much hope for genuine social revolution from below.
The mob.
And they wrote about it. It's funny. They didn't hide any of this shit.
No,
like
Federalist
guys like,
Papers, it's right in there.
The people are a great beast. Who said that? Rappin' Alexander Hamilton
there
said
you
that.
go, folks. The liberal hero.
Madison dripped with terror at the thought of the rude mob taking hold of the reins of power.
Never seen the play, but I doubt that's in there.
Yeah, no, not really. Just there's
instead
him in the Whiskey Rebellion when he's organizing the troops, yelling, "Quote, pay your fucking taxes." I think is the line
really
he uses.
Yeah. Wow. Whiskey Rebellion was like the abortive sort of like social revolutionary aspect of that.
And
crushed by
according to Lin-Manuel Miranda, that could be boiled down to sassy rapping Alexander Hamilton saying, "Pay your taxes." Why you not pay your taxes?
Again, folks, this is what we're here for.
Forget the icy tendrils of finance capitalism are wrapping themselves. They're reaching from New York City to wrap their icy fingers around your neck in fucking rural Western Massachusetts.
These yeoman farmers.
And you're like, we literally fought for this. We died for this. We are not going to let this. We're not going to give the king turn over the king's rule for the rule of the clique of financiers, and then they were put down, which boiled down to these fucking basically Tea Party. I mean, they're just a bunch of yahoos. They're just a bunch of Mayo boys who won't pay their taxes.
It's one thing, if a bunch of like New York merchants have a tax revolt, or Boston merchants have a tax revolt. Whole other thing if a bunch of dirt farmers.
No, thank you.
In the Berkshires.
Yeah, no,
God
thank you.
forbid they do that.
Oh no.
I think you touched on another important thing too, right? For folks to remember is that, again, United States, as it is today, not virgin land. There were people here. However, they didn't have the guns. They didn't have the germs. They didn't have the steel.
Yeah.
They know all about stuff. Stuff. The social system previous even to capitalism, you may have heard of before. It's called feudalism.
Mm-hmm.
And capitalism obviously arises out of that. That's a long conversation. I tried to put a show together on that, but it was way too much out there. Even Matt.
That is the Everest, really? Trying to suss out the fucking world systems theory from conventional way.
Oh my god, yeah, it was too much. I mean, maybe we'll get there at some point in time, but I think
we'll take DMT and then we'll crack the case,
Joe Rogan style.
Hell yeah!
Imagine Joe Rogan but Marxist.
I would love to sit him down and try to explain Brenner versus Wallenstein. Oh my god,
his eyes would be so fucking blank.
They would just be wall-eyed, just drooling.
But what if we got him though?
Oh, let's do it.
That'd be a huge fucking. If we
do it.
3 million hits.
Oh my
god.
God,
get Rogan. Maybe someday you guys can make it on fucking. Rogan.
We're trying to get Felix on, and it would be ideal because he's an MMA guy.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, they could bro down about everything.
Yeah.
One of the things about feudalism is that, especially as it sort of congeals into a long-standing, centuries-long social system in Europe, but also with echoes in places like China, and India in the East, is that the fundamental contradictory classes within that are the producers of the peasantry on the one hand, who at least in serfdom, but also just regular peasant society, they are tenants on the land of the lord. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they're bound, sometimes they are not, right? But they have to kick up, mafia style, a certain portion of that to their lord in protection money, essentially, right? So feudalism, there's a big history there, but if we break it down, right, you've got the peasants and you've got the landlords. You have some other classes.
A society of orders.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That's important, a society of orders, right? There are these different estates within society, right? Almost like a caste system for class.
Yeah, with different rights and privileges attended to each.
And rights and privileges and obligations.
Yes.
Very, very importantly, right? An interesting explanation, I think, and you might agree with me on this, is that going back to, say, like 1100 and 1200 AD in Europe, right? And we all know that the United States is a Judeo-Christian Western civilization.
Oh, yeah.
We get a lot of our traditions and customary rights from there. If you go back into this era, the class struggle was fucking real.
Mm-hmm.
And not only was it really real, but in a sense, it was a sort of fundamental like pressure valve, like almost like this balancing act between this producing class, which would be expropriated of a portion of what they produced, and a landlord class, right, which would be forced oftentimes to give concessions. And there was a way in which this sort of moving back and forth between rebellion and then concessions and negotiations kind of kept the system stable.
It was a stable homeostasis, and where class struggle was managed and relieved through a negotiation whereby pressure was relieved in ways small, from something like a carnival or a feast day.
The world turned upside down.
Yeah, to work strikes, right? Work stoppages, to peasant revolt. And all of these had the same function, which was to provide feedback to the ruling class that things needed to change to maintain the structure.
Right.
And it, for generations, was very successful, and it was a very relatively stable system. But then you got capitalism come along.
Wait, there was another class? There was a marginal
By
class?
God, is that the bourgeois music?
Yeah. Are those the bourgeoisie? Are those the town-dwelling merchants?
Yeah, there was
the
just something a little,
class?
for these guys, there's just something a little stale about this arrangement.
Yeah,
There's a
it's
little
all this
stultifying.
fuddy-duddy
There's not
shit,
really
yeah.
enough a surplus being developed
Yeah.
to allow for human expression to really reach its
productive
potential.
forces.
They're
Adam
not-
Smith
yeah.
had to come in ex post facto
Yes.
and explain why that
Yes.
feudal system needed to be gotten rid of. But I think importantly for this discussion, European civilization under feudalism has, as Matt said, this kind of homeostasis, but one which is built in conflict, but conflict between these classes that never fully erupts. There may be revolts. You may have the pitchforks come out. They may go surround the castle.
Yes.
You know, they may demand that the tithe go,
Yes.
less taxes to the landlord. They may get concessions. They may get beaten back, right? And then they go into penury again. They may escape. But this system was a system where struggle was habitual, it was traditional, and it was a struggle between classes that the European peoples, whether they're on the top or the bottom, were well trained in over the centuries.
It created a fundamental social cohesion, which capitalism, as soon as it showed up, started to destabilize and has never been able to stop. In fact, the process has only accelerated. It's a one-way ratchet that because nothing in capitalism countervails it. So, unlike feudalism, which led to social cohesion, capitalism is just a solvent on that immediately, and that created the process whereby these forms are becoming unstable. But that could lead in an era of increased capitalism, especially with industrialism, creating a new category of worker whose labor is more alienated than ever, whose life is more immiserated than ever.
But is doubly free.
Exactly. This might have erupted, but before that social cohesion created by feudalism could be fully rendered, a new safety valve came into being.
Ah, yes.
And that new safety valve was emigration to the big empty spaces of the Western Hemisphere. All that social conflict, all of those irresolvable fights, they don't have to be resolved because the people who are in fundamental odds, the people who are too excess in population, too unable to access basic subsistence, instead of having to fight for their very lives the way they would if they had to stay, they can hit the road.
Yes, and to say that another way, feudalism, as you said, as this stable, ordered system, as it breaks down through actually the pressures of marketization, but also the increase in productive forces and technology, it changes the entire scope of human productive activity from one of extensive growth, right? Where, like, if you want to create more crops, you will conquer or take over more lands, right? As Europe fills up with people, especially after the Black Death and the human population comes back in the Middle Ages, it gets to the point where that extensive spread within Europe can't happen anymore. One of the arguments for why capitalism comes into being as such a powerful mode of production is that you now must become intensive. You must take the same amount of land, the same amount of labor at first, and then make it more productive in order for there to be, more advancement and more growth and this, that, and the other thing. But as Matt points to, in a Europe that's filled with people, in a Europe where those people are accustomed to a certain traditional way of life within the feudal mode of production, and also accustomed to fighting, for their rights, for those customs and those obligations, all of a sudden with the discovery of the New World, which, yes, does include what is now the United States of America, you now have the ability to have another extensive growth of the capitalist market and capitalist social relations into other parts of the world. This is a sink for what Matt called surplus populations. Those are people who, as you have more kids, but you don't have any more land, where do they go? You have an uprising that gets put down. 1848, for example,
yes,
is a great example of that. Tons, thousands, millions of emigres leave because there's new lands that are opened up where this pressure valve of the class struggle can then be resolved by sending people off to a new place.
And that meant that for the second half of the 19th century, which is when this happened, which is when you either were going to get a socialist party or you weren't, the proving ground time, there's a stark difference in the social order of these two places, the United States and Western Europe. In Western Europe, not only are people operating in the framework of remembered and still durable social obligations and customs from feudalism, but the class struggle created by capitalism is being redirected outwards in the form of allowing for emigration. That means that social cohesion still exists, and that means that when a social class comes into itself the way that labor classes did, the option of integrating them into the political system is it's organic. It's a rising out of a social order that has not been brutalized essentially and rended by class struggle. Of course, it was in the 20th century, and that's when all the blood, because the book that spawned this question was written in 1906. By the mid-century, these questions are largely moot. The rise of fascism, all these. I mean, World War II, of course, breaks the idol, destroys the whole thing. All that tension in the string comes back. But in that moment before that, you still had these within because that's why it had to be directed outward in the form of imperial warfare, because it was the focus on maintaining internal harmony was so strong, which means you integrate your working class in. Pressure from both bourgeois classes and the working class has led to a flowering of political freedoms and the creation of party democracy. What a coincidence! We're a party now, or we have a party. You want a party? We're a class, okay? And that's what happened.
And Germany is like the perfect fucking example.
The one that became the model for all the other ones, where all of the revisionist theory came from, Kautsky-Bernstein, the place. I mean, it's where the first party was founded, LaSalle. It is the hothouse because it's a place where a lot of these processes were the most firmly embedded. You're talking. I mean, you want to talk feudal? This place was literally duchies and cantons and free cities and bishoprics until the middle of the 19th century, for the love of God. But also incredibly productive industrially and very densely populated. All the things you'd need for this process to be put in overdrive, like the fucking mold on Lisa's tooth when she puts it in the fucking soda. Right. Meanwhile, though, while that's happening in Europe, in the United States, not only do you have the despoliation and dispossession of a native people, not only do you have the wholesale importation of another subject people to be a hyper-exploited slave class that builds the literal productive capacity with their own blood, and
not just in the South, but also
of
in
course,
the North.
The entire bourgeois economy of the North is just a feeder for the blood run from the flesh of slaves in the South.
The famous Lehman Brothers was actually begun by some New York merchants and traders who went down to trade in cotton and slaves in the South, and this becomes, the famous Lehman Brothers that collapsed. But Northern capital is completely, you cannot extricate that from Southern slavery.
That's why you had guys, very guilty guys like the Tappins, who wanted to sort of expunge their sense of guilty conscience about being attendant to the whole thing by funding the abolitionist movement. But who's doing this exploitation? Who's doing this? It is the European diaspora. It is people ripped from those social fabrics that we were talking about that took centuries to build. Ripped free of them, come to the New World to do what? To make a way for themselves and their immediate family, without any ties to the society, building new communities out of scratch, and at the same time either directly exploiting the labor of slaves or being party to the continued genocide of the native population.
Right. So people have heard of Manifest Destiny. Of course, you probably got that in high school, maybe even before.
Go west, young man, and grow up with the country.
Yeah. There's the old Turner thesis, which we can touch on. But
yes.
I just wanted to connect two different things because we're telling this history about what's happening in Europe, about this history of class struggle within feudalism, a group of different classes who are used to struggling. They're used to a certain customary, ordered way of life that's being disrupted within Europe, especially in the 19th century, right? Meanwhile, in the United States, without having had a social revolution and creating a constitution that has embedded within it all of the principles of bourgeois economy. Of course, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was cribbed directly from Life, Liberty, and Property by John Locke.
Indeed.
Right? This was from the beginning, a capitalist society with a constitution built for that. So when you take what Matt's saying about all these surplus populations leaving Europe and coming to this new world, there was no political infrastructure within the United States to even mitigate in any sort of way the kind of class struggles that you saw not just under feudalism but rising industrial capitalism in Europe.
Yeah.
Which leads us then past the genocide of the Native Americans and then past the enslavement of millions and millions of Africans and African Americans, right? It leads us to the great, tremendous, brutal, violent, often heroic labor struggles of the United States in the 19th century as this party form already exists, as this constitution already exists.
Right. And that is, I think, the salient point when you talk about the violence. Because I think a persuasive argument has been made that in the best proximate explanation for the failure of a socialist party in the United States is the degree of violence the state was willing to mete out to oppose the labor movement, which was unique in the Western world. If you look at the U.S., if you look at the labor history in countries like France, Germany, Australia, the UK, and you compare the list of American, even just like the top 10 most known labor atrocities, the Ludlow Massacre,
Sure.
There's a Homestead strike,
Yeah.
I mean, the Haymarket.
Yeah.
I mean, you can go on. They don't have anything like that. Like, I remember Jeremy Corbyn, somebody was trying to talk about how he's a communist because he laid a wreath at the grave of like these martyrs. It's like, I forget the name of them, but there's a gravestone where these 4 guys got transported to Australia for forming a union.
Oh.
And this was in like the 1820s.
Yeah.
And it was 4 guys got transported to Australia for deciding to band together against an employer. One of them, I think, died in Australia. One of them stayed there. And then their case became a cause célèbre, and they got clemency. And then the 2 other ones came home. And then that's it. That's the story. And that's one of the most.
And they got hysterical about it.
Yeah, it's one of the most, like, that and like the Peterloo Massacre. A couple guys got run over by a horse.
Right.
The
famous
United
one with Churchill,
Yeah.
where he had a Tommy gun and a bunch of workers got
The
hit.
United States, it's like just unloading firearms into helpless crowds. It's cutting off Frank Little's fucking balls and stringing him from
hanging the Haymarket martyrs.
Yes, and killing Joe Hill.
Yeah, and killing Joe Hill, and onwards and onwards.
But the thing about that is that it is persuasive as a proximate cause because it is such an outlier. But it also only begs a question, really. So it's like, all right, well, why? And the answer is because it's a different social structure.
Yes.
It's a social structure where, for the long time, labor was defined by coercion to a degree that was completely transcended feudalism, because a feudal subject has a stake in the order. A slave does not, and therefore is a existential threat.
Yes.
And so there's not the same relationship between worker and manager when slavery is involved.
Right.
And then
slave revolts were not a safety valve; they were an existential crisis for the system in the United States.
And that logic pervaded then once the industrial working class comes into being and is peopled largely by immigrants who provide another level of separation from Americans who can therefore see them in the same sort of existential sense, the same separateness.
Right.
Like I said, it's the opposite of social cohesion.
Yes.
And therefore anything is permissible.
Like violence is permissible on a level that would be unthinkable in Europe, whereby that kind of violence would rend a social fabric to a degree that would be detrimental to the ruling class.
100%. And when you say that, it makes me think, like, would it even be like, could we even imagine something like the Pinkertons in a European country at a similar time? Could you imagine, like, because as you said, the American working class is split by language, by nationality, by the color line, of course, right?
Skills.
By traditions and skills and all these different, and obviously gender, right? Famously, Jay Gould, the railroad tyrant and tycoon, said, "I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half." It's a lot easier to do that in a country where you've got kind of the detritus, the surplus from the old world, who are disembedded from their cultural and tradition and their lives that they had there. There's these immigrants coming, and they're also unable to communicate with one another. And this is like one of course, the beautiful things about the IWW, and partially why they failed, right, is that you could actually have if people don't know, because we're going to go back to basics here, when Matt talks about violence, it was not just the state. The state actually is a little late to the game when it comes to violence. When there were injunctions and the National Guard would come in and shoot up a bunch of workers, there were private armies. Like, let's be clear, folks. Like, the capitalist class of the United States, the Pinkertons and others, were a private mercenary army. They are the future that right libertarians want.
Oh yeah,
essentially.
Yes.
Like, the level of violence in was it the Ludlow massacre where they had the tents.
They machine gun. It was an encampment of families. Yes. And they opened fire with fucking Maxim machine guns, just strafed them, and knocked over cooking lamps and caused a fire that just cooked women and children to death in the pits that they'd built underneath the tents.
And that is, as you say, very unique. And I think that the immigrant and the race line thing is important, and also the frontier aspect of it too. But I want to go back to what the political question again, because I think this ties in well with it, is that because we had this political revolution and not a social revolution, and because the U.S. Constitution is both, as you said with Hamilton, a conservative document, but also one that is deeply imbued and embedded with bourgeois rights, with property and obligation and contract to the market. A fun fact, the reason why you could have a Pinkerton, the reason why strikes could be broken so violently and brutally in the United States, and so often, for since the 1830s to the 1930s, so this 100-year period, is that labor, it's almost Marxist in a sense, right? The way that the Supreme Court would argue it is that your labor, they wouldn't call it labor power, right? But your ability to work for a boss is a commodity. And if you and your cohorts were to go on strike together, and you were to stop other commodities, i.e. human beings, from going into that factory because you had these certain demands, then you are actually breaking one of the fundamental aspects of the American social and political system, which is freedom of contract and freedom of trade. Because if labor is a commodity, you cannot band together to stop a capitalist from buying human labor. This was the law. This was the foundation all the way up into the Wagner Act in the 1930s. So it's not like, America had such brutal capitalists. They were the worst people in the world. You've got all these divisions.
Feeling like Lochner.
Yeah, it was built into the actual political and social fabric of this country that labor did not have the right to do the things that, again, customarily with like the guild system in Europe, people had won the right to do over and over and over again and kept that right.
Correct.
Yeah, so then how you tie this again back into the more surface explanation, which is the political party system in the United States versus, say, the UK or Germany or elsewhere, I think, is by, again, reiterating this point based on what we just talked about, that the United States political party system never actually had a working class, like a directly working class party. Like the Labor Party, for decades, essentially the unions put up their delegates to run in the party. There was a direct connection, for better or for worse. I mean, actually, the joke about the UK Labour Party is that it was more Methodist than Marxist.
Yeah.
But be that as it may, right? They have an NHS and we don't, right? The Democratic Party, even at its height, right? You couldn't even call that a true Labour Party, right?
No, it was never a Labour Party. It was a laborers' party, partially. When it was originally founded, because it was a coalition of urban immigrants and yeoman farmers. And the thing is that they didn't really have much in the way of common interests besides a hostility towards finance capital as it was emerging, because there was this dim awareness, even if working class didn't exist, that there was a threat to autonomy and livelihood, either if you're working as a farmer or if you're trying to sell labor in an urban area. But that was kind of it in terms of what united them. And then over time, the opposition to the Democrats coalesced first into the Whigs and then into the Republicans, and they also had a pitch to workers.
Right.
And
labor, free land.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and a very strong pitch to yeoman farmers. I mean, it's. I think Jackson would have probably had a stroke to see that it was the Republican Party, the heir to the Whigs, who passed the Homestead Act. Vote yourself a farm. I mean, that would have been a Democratic, slogan.
I mean, Dinesh D'Souza loves that was the Republicans.
Right, of course. So it was just one element among others, and of course, like others, over time, it became marked by the same racial and regional and also ethnic lines, to the point where you get the 1924 Democratic Convention in New York that took 108 ballots.
Was that Al Smith?
He was running against a guy, John McAdoo, who I think had been Wilson's Treasury Secretary, and they were both running as stand-ins for the urban. It was ostensibly about prohibition. It was between the wets and the dries. But that was a stand-in for region and employment. The urban working class Catholics were backing Smith and the end of Prohibition, and the rural Protestant farmers were backing McAdoo and the
and burning
and the dries,
burning crosses.
They were
against Al Smith.
They were. There were Klan marches in front of the convention hall. Fist fights inside it.
A papist president, run by Rome.
They ended up picking a compromise candidate. But then, 4 years later, Smith got it relatively easily because that fight was won. But it was never hegemonic, as we said, and so FDR gave it its biggest influence on a major party. That period from FDR till probably the Hubert Humphrey campaign, which was almost entirely funded by the AFL-CIO, and the Sargento frozen food company in Minnesota, I believe.
Are you serious?
I think so.
Is that some local history for?
Yeah.
Like, what did they do in that whole thing?
There was a guy who owned it who was just a big, great friend and fan of Hubert Humphrey.
Oh wow!
And so he wrote huge checks for the campaign.
So to replace the AFL-CIO money, like I think an important thing too, when we start to talk about, as you said, the Democrats becoming this sort of Labor Party, is you have these cross-class and kind of like urban versus rural divides within the party system, and as you said before, these two parties are eventually able to kind of co-opt and recuperate any sort of threat that might come from the Populist Party or, what was it called? The People's Party.
Yeah.
The Farmers, the Greenback Party, whatever it may be. Part of the issue that's happening in the United States up until this moment at the turn of the 20th century is that when we had that frontier, when we still had a manifest destiny, the United States itself, similar to what we were talking about with the capitalist countries of Europe, also had this safety valve. And it was not for nothing that that these property rights were written into the Constitution of the United States, because it was written for yeomen, farmers, and artisans and merchants. Mm-hmm. There was this sense that we're not held down by these old feudal customs, and by defending property rights, we're defending the majority of the people who were small landowners, or they had they were heads of a guild, or they were, traders in cities, whatever the case may be. But similar to what's happening, that's this process of sending European workers over to the United States, as the frontier in the United States closes, right? As capitalism basically degrades our own sort of artisan system and turns it more towards mass production, and there's no more room for people to push out into a Homestead Act, that class struggle rises not because, workers are particularly ornery or because bosses are particularly greedy, right?
Yeah.
It's because these same processes that happened in Europe are now taking place in the United States. There's a direct confrontation now, and that manifests itself incredibly, in the strikes of the 1870s and into the 1890s. And then I think the real formation of what we conceive of as the closest thing to a labor party is the heroic period of struggle that creates the Congress of Industrial Organizations in the 1930s, which really, with FDR latching onto it, it seems like the United States has finally caught up to the rest of the world. It looks like to a lot of people that we have the Workers' Party. My great-grandfather that I told you about, to his dying day, had a framed picture of FDR on his wall because he was literally the man that helped him with his union struggles, and that he voted Democrat for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
But, however, I think you would argue perhaps that the sense that we finally found that socialist or that Labor Party and the Democrats is maybe a little tenuous.
Well, what happened was the end of the Second Civil War and the advent of the Cold War. It's like throwing a bucket of water, fucking freezing water on it, because there's just a general reactionary trend away from the consolidation that had happened, and in a country where at that point, the Labor Party would be inextricably linked, or the Labor Party would be organically tied together.
And institutionally tied.
Yeah. Then that would leave them little strategic move to pivot, because they're tied. The Democrats weren't like that. The Democrats weren't tied to labor movement. So they were able to pivot and try to grab a different segment at the expense of labor, at the expense of the CIO, because as people have pointed out, the Red Scare started with Truman.
Yeah.
I mean, and Atchison.
Yeah.
It was only later refined by guys like Nixon and McCarthy.
Yeah, for the folks who this is a new history to, right? So the CIO is this incredible moment, especially during the war, for very bizarre historical reasons, right? Grows to like 8 million people over the course of like these massive social struggles, and is like fully integrated into FDR's New Deal. But then, as Matt points out, you have the Taft-Hartley Act. Didn't they call it like the slavery, like the wage slavery act or something? The union leaders did, and the leftists within the United States. Very quickly, the communist, socialist, and anarchist forces that were the real spearhead behind this militant labor union that had been tied into the Democratic Party. With the rise of the Cold War, the Taft-Hartley comes out as really the opening salvo against the left, against socialism in the United States. And people always think of McCarthy and they think of like, how dare you, sir, have you no decency? Yeah. But really, the most crucial moment, I think, for breaking that linkage between the militancy of the working class and the organic ties with the working class is the Taft-Hartley Act, which, besides, putting in laws that make it harder to organize, also required the unions to kick out any communists that were members, also to have a loyalty oath to the United States. So under Truman, a Democrat, he vetoed it, and the anti-communist sentiment in 1947 was so great that it passed over his veto. The first moment of Red Scare was internal. It was against those forces within the United States who wanted a deeper social democracy, something like socialism.
And as has been pointed out, the first chair of the House Un-American Activities Committee, Martin Dees, was a Democrat.
There you go.
From Texas, because those Southern Democrats were a key component of that coalition, and it was not mutual. It was only very broadly mutual goals at that point. There was deep conflict between the labor base of the Democrats and the Southern reactionary base.
We'll give you your Tennessee Valley Authority. We will allow workers to organize, but not domestics and not farm workers,
and not down here. We'll keep it a state issue. You can do what you want. Go hog wild in New York.
Yeah.
But we're going to be we're going to keep running those labor organizers out of town on a rail.
Exactly. The Southern strategy fails. The Democratic Party, even at its height of what we could call laborism or socialism, is a deeply contradictory political formation that includes both reactionary elements and also progressive elements.
Mm-hmm.
Never a labor party.
Never.
This is crucial, I think. So as you said, like moving forward in this golden age of American capitalism, by the time you get to the 60s and 70s, labor had always been an interest group, a very important one, a hegemonic one, right? But as years went by and capitalism went into crisis in the late 60s and into the 70s, and you had more and more professional managerial types, and you started fighting on the, the battlefield of culture instead of bread and butter, right?
Mm-hmm.
It became the constituency that the Democratic Party could essentially jettison and still win elections.
All these suburbanites, all these knowledge industry suburbanites
who had property
and
houses.
They're worried about their school district and what's this? All these industries are willing to give us money too now that we're not tied to labor in such a way that we have to vote in their interests. They're willing to give us more money so that we have a broader mind on these issues. This is fantastic. And then labor dies on the vine. But this leads to, I think, a really interesting thing that Eric Foner once pointed out in an article he wrote called "Why Is There No Socialism in the United States?"
I got a boner for Foner. Give it to
me. And he wrote this in the 80s, and it's a piece where he restates the question with almost a century of additional knowledge that Sobert had, and he goes methodically through many different suggestions. He picks them up, he turns them around, he grants them their explanatory power, then he points out their deficiencies, points out the deficiencies in all of them, says none of them are fully satisfying. Even together, they leave some questions. And he leaves it sort of unresolved in that sense, but then he asks a separate question that is incredibly precise, insightful, especially considering when he wrote it, which was the mid-'80s, which is that he looked around and he said, Sombart was asking this question when the American Democratic Party, this hybrid cross-class party with stitched together out of all these parts and always co-opting the left without ever really being beholden to it, contrasted with things like the Social Democratic Party in Germany, this solid, organic labor party. But to look at that, ask that question, even in the 80s, you were looking at political parties in Europe that may have those same names, but that in their particulars were essentially identical in their trajectory and policies to the American Democratic Party.
Right.
And so Foner says, in now, knowing what we know, the real question is, why was the United States basically first? Why are we ahead of the curve
on the neoliberal turn?
Exactly, because they're all because Sombart asking a meaningful question because he didn't know what these parties were going to end up. Like maybe fucking Kautsky was right. Maybe they were going to vote themselves socialism in Germany.
You had
who could know?
You had the Meidner plan in Sweden.
Exactly, even into the 20th century.
In the 1970s, they were literally going to expropriate capital and give it to the workers through social democracy.
It was a soft guillotine.
Yes.
They were going to just buy the stock until they owned it all.
I know, and it almost worked.
It almost worked.
Close. It was like the high point.
God.
The peaceful road to real socialism. That's fascinating to flip it on its head.
And it's like, but now those parties are basically the American Democratic Party.
And to the extent that they even exist, they're fucking dead, right? Because they took this neoliberal turn, and even with like the Labour Party in the UK, and Corbyn is actually a very, very interesting kind of counterexample, and maybe we'll talk about what the future holds for this, right? But like, the Labour Party in the UK never lost its ties to the union. Nope. Even Tony Blair, even though he got rid of Article 4 for what that was worth, had said that we should collectivize the means of production as the Labour Party or whatever. Even Tony Blair could never jettison the power of the labor unions, right? It still meant, and this again I think shows us like the deep world historical and like historical materialist reasons like why these things, or at least it begs the question of like why across the entire capitalist globe does this shift happen, and what is it about the United States that we may have been exceptional but only to the extent that we got there first.
Exactly. And I think we've gotten towards it in what we've talked about, when the vagaries of this created a situation where the Europe was operating with this buffer, this socially coherent buffer inherited from feudalism and maintained by the pressure valve of emigration, that allowed it to withstand the pressures. Because that's the amazing thing about industrial capitalism. Once it really gets going, is that in the Western Hemisphere and in Europe, it takes hold and it spreads immensely quickly, and it integrates things at an astonishing speed.
Yes. It's that acid that dissolves.
It's just
all
it goes crazy.
Yeah.
But this buffer of vestigial feudal ties and obligations and social cohesion buys them some time, basically.
Right, yeah,
so that means that in their heyday of social democracy, which we all had about the same time too, for the same reason, reacting to the Great Depression and fascism.
Even in fascist Germany,
exactly,
there was a very similar move towards state-oriented developmentalism.
But it's that what they got out of it before the tide rolled back was more significant because of that buffer zone, because of it allowed the cultivation of organic and durable labor parties. So when the tide rolls back, they are left in an impoverished situation and rapidly deteriorating, but with things like NHS,
right?
With things like social care,
it's a great height for which they fall.
And so they're falling from. So they have. We got a little bit of stuff. We were able to get social care for 65 and older, but only we couldn't get it. We were, and like there was plans on the table for free college for everyone on the fucking board during the Johnson administration, and then Vietnam came along and it just wiped it right off of the table. So we were getting there, but we were retarded. We were held back.
He does not mean that
I don't
in the
mean
way
that.
that you think. He means
I mean literally
kept back.
We were kept back by the fact that we were thrown like crabs into a bucket to fight it off on this blood-soaked, expropriated land.
Yes.
And so we didn't have the durable social formations to negotiate with capital at the best possible terms. We had a hand behind our back. They were able to negotiate at much better terms before it all started to fall apart.
Yes, and I would add only one thing to that too, and I don't want to make like a vulgar geographical determinist argument. I also don't want to make a Malthusian argument too, but at the same the structural change that happened within the United States with the suburbanization, the movement of the working class through state subsidy, by the way, from the cities and into the suburbs, in a way kind of revives that yeoman sense of like ownership and property and propriety, which is very deleterious. It had been in the 19th century, and it revives itself in the 1950s and 60s as working class enclaves in the Midwest or in New York City are dispersed. Your union hall used to be up the street from your house. You used to, all the Swedes, the squareheads down in Sunset Park, they all had the same union and they all would have the parades together. All of a sudden, they're in New Jersey, they're at Staten Island, and then home ownership then becomes the American dream, which takes it from a collective, like we're a union solidaristic network of workers together, and there is some potential for socialism there, to we are dispersed, atomized monads living with our picket fences in the suburbs, and our material interests then come to be reflected in our political interests.
That I honestly think that doesn't get talked about enough as a cause, like a fundamental fact, is that suburbanization just helped drive a fucking stake in the heart of working class culture in this country. It basically made it impossible. Yeah. And the thing is that they liked it.
Yeah,
they wanted it too.
But why wouldn't you?
Of course.
You're living in a fucking tenement, and all of a sudden you're a veteran, and if you're white especially, the government's going to give you a cheap fucking mortgage.
Exactly. Everyone wanted that. Everyone wanted a piece of it, and they were happy to give it, and it was this. It satisfied the material desires of a working class. So in a direct sense, it was something that they would have put on their agenda, but with the long-term effect of dissolving solidarity in acid.
And that, I think, is a perfect fucking place to end this out with talking about, given this history, what is the future? Because on that suburbanization tip, right, we've seen now a flight of both capital and skilled labor back into the cities, and the suburbs and the exurbs are now the new, essentially, ghettos in the United States of America, right? The extent to which what's called neoliberalism has imbricated itself in every aspect of American life has to be complete. I'm not sure how much farther it can go. Can it go farther?
I mean, until we dissolve into gray goo. I mean, I feel real imbricated, bro. I feel so fucking imbricated.
I feel lubricated from this.
I am soaking in it.
Yeah, fucking like. Here's the thing: is we've bounced back and forth in this long history between like there being this extensive, this intensive, there being an inside, there being an outside, there being like these institutions and organic wholes and connections, and in a way, like the suburbanization and even in a sense neoliberalism was able to rescue capitalism from its doldrums in the 1970s. But it seems like we're living in this weird like interregnum period since the crash of 10 years ago, where that neoliberal order is dead or dying.
It's a bloated corpse.
And but the new world is yet to be born.
Indeed.
Even if that's a
now is the time
world.
Of monsters.
Yes, indeed.
Said.
So many monsters, and some of them are orange.
Big orange fucking monsters with tiny fucking fingers.
You seen Steve Bannon lately?
Yeah, that is a rough beast slouching towards Bethlehem. Holy fuck.
Slouching towards fucking Wall Street. So like
slouching towards Golden Corral.
The question is then, right, like given this history and given that startling turn that you gave with the phoner, which really kind of flips things on its head, you know, if the United States is exceptional for political economic reasons and historical materialist reasons and all these other sort of contingent aspects that we talked about, political reasons, right? Like what could we even imagine a potential socialist movement or future even looking like in the United States, let alone in Europe or Asia or elsewhere? It's a huge question.
It's a huge question, and it's the hardest question to answer because it's in my opinion, the opening premise is the most challenging question for socialists have ever felt in any context, from theoretical to the practical application, and that is internationalism. It was understood from the beginning of Marx to be crucial to the project, but it has been an incredible stumbling block the entire existence of real socialism and real social activism.
1914, baby. That might have been when everything was proved wrong.
Yep. Honestly, nationalism is such an enduring and persistent bug, and it's nauseating watching these cheap mountebanks like fucking Tucker Carlson and Richard Spencer and Tulsi Gabbard taking socialism and just cynically welding it to this revanchist notion of humanity that says the only people who count are inside our borders.
Yes.
Because they're moving towards the syncretic concept of everyone is. It's all marching towards
a third
syncretic
position.
Concept of the third position of National Socialism. Because they recognize, unlike the other deluded idiots on the right, the capitalism is dead. Something will come up from it. They don't want to cede it to the international revolutionary movement, for the love of God. They want to rescue what they can. And if that's just the hierarchies, if that's just the racial and class hierarchies, they'll take those.
Oh, sure.
If they'll negotiate on everything else. And so they're pitching to people who have the nascent sense of how much they're exploited and how miserable they are and how capitalism has failed them. And they say, yes, why is this happening to you? Why is this happening to us, the good people on earth, the people who matter?
Yeah.
Why is that happening?
Western civilization.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that creates this bunker fortress socialism that and the thing is, it's compatible with drone war. Yeah. It's compatible with endless techno war because a lot of them like to talk about how they're anti-war. A lot of credulous leftists like to celebrate them for being anti-war, but they're only anti-war to the degree that they want to reduce American vulnerability elsewhere, spending blood and treasure to not be doing what needs to be done, which is defending hierarchies and racial classes and gender regimens at home. And if you can create a techno war on terror that's like a self-mowing lawnmower that like operates on its own power, just a fleet of AI and equipped drones that bomb on their own recognizance and don't involve any human input and are solar powered and never land and kill 5,000 people a year, they would have no problem with that. If people fucking pile up at the fucking wall in their hundreds of millions of corpses, they don't have a problem with that either.
Yeah, not at
and
all.
the thing is that that's no alternative to neoliberalism because neoliberalism leads there too.
Right. Yes. It does. It's fascinating because we were talking about inside and outside, right? What is the most salient political, issue right now? We know because the government's still shut down. It's migration, right? there's no longer any outside to capitalism.
Right.
So there's only now borders. There's only protecting yourself from the inside,
Yep.
from those people who in the past would have gone to quote-unquote virgin lands
Yes.
in order to make a better life for themselves. So internationalism as socialists means way more now than it meant at any other time, because if we don't do internationalism, it's almost like it's structurally dependent that if we continue with capitalism, that it will have to be nationalistic. And if it is nationalistic, it is going to be chauvinistic.
Yep.
And if it's going to be chauvinistic but also pretend to keep some sort of stability and order for the working people within that, it's going to have to provide essentially what's called a Herrenvolk social democracy, which is, benefits for the right people, the white people, right? And everybody else, damn them, with the climate crisis happening, with
because it's going to be
still low.
It's a resource issue. Who's going to get the resources? Because we're
out of free ones.
Exactly. It's no longer a question of allocating resources, a bounty of resources. It's a question of the lifeboat, and it's who's out and in. And that's why socialism, if it's going to be an alternative, and I think this is the pitch to the less cynical of these people who are drawn in by some of this, is that if it's going to be an alternative to fucking capitalism, because it's all leading to the same thing, it's all leading to walls and fucking bloodbaths and a racial caste and probably the army controlling the economy anyway. Yeah. Like the markets are going to be secondary to just maintaining sustenance. So it's all leading there anyway. It's just a question of the direction. If there's going to be a meaningful alternative, it has to start from the assumption that everybody is worthy of life regardless of where they're born, and that everybody is worthy, desires the fruits of existence as we all do equally, and that the only way we're getting it is by cooperating.
Right.
The only way we're going to bring this because all these resources are going to be depleted. We're going to cook the earth into competition with each other on a national basis. Everyone's going to eventually resolve around externalizing the problem and internalizing the gain. Externalities out and privatizing the gains to your group. And
to get out of the political and nation state question, which I think, as you say, is very fucking crucial right now. Even just from the vulgar sort of forces of production analysis of history, right? It is true that the Green New Deal would be a great stopgap measure and would probably do great things for people in the United States of America, right? But in terms of the intensive increase in technology and techniques of producing the things like food and goods cheaply, and for all in this capitalist global economy, right? That hard work has been done. Like capitalism has done that job.
Yes.
It's like never before has the world been so pregnant for a post-scarcity society.
Absolutely.
But never before have the stakes been so fucking high in making it happen within a generation.
Yes.
Because we have the ability to move beyond, you can call it socialism, you can call it communism, you can just call it happy fun rainbow mode of production, whatever you want to call it, right? Like we are pregnant with the ability to overcome both borders and also scarcity. And the more we realize that we are backed into this corner now, like you were saying, right, where either which way we go, it's fucking global genocide on a massive scale. The Peter Thiels of the world in their fucking vampire castles, just sucking the semen out of babies, whatever the fuck they do to live the rest of their lives, before we all get fucking boiled in the oceans, right? It is absolutely necessary that the folks out there who care, as we do, and if you're listening to this, you do, to understand that history of failure of socialism in the United States does not necessarily mean that we need to go back and ape what was done 100 and 120 years ago. We live in a different period now. I'm not saying Bernie Sanders is bad, but perhaps we don't need a new deal. Perhaps we need an internationalist, cooperative movement, or even call it a revolution if you want, right? That instead of the choice of neoliberal death or fascist death, gives us the other option, which is to live in I'm going to sound cheesy now, but the community of mankind, humankind. And I think that it's the goal, it should be the goal, and it certainly should be the prerogative of every leftist out there to start thinking of new tactics, new strategies, and new ideas to get us out of this fucking cul-de-sac, because the cul-de-sac's on fire.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is a blank page, and no bad ideas in brainstorming, folks.
Yeah, guys, let's just throw everything at the fucking wall.
Yeah.
So just because, there's no socialism, there's no Labor Party in the United States, that's fine.
Yeah.
We're going to move forward. Now you know why.
Absolutely.
Let's just move past it with that knowledge. Think about what that means and arm yourself to the teeth. Get a bunker. No, don't do that. I
Don't do
not
that.
recommend doing that.
Don't do that. I'm already on probation.
We'll talk about that in the Discord. But I think that's good for today.
Yeah,
I think we should probably do another one of these sometime.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, let's do some more.
Yeah, we'll definitely do some more. So